Tonight, a new era. Labour's first budget for 14 years sees taxes put up by £40 billion. The Chancellor says she's protecting working people, but it's businesses bearing the brunt of the pain. There's more cash for the NHS and billions more in borrowing. But the OBR says the boost to growth is only short-term.
This is a moment of fundamental choice for Britain. I have made my choices, the responsible choices, to restore stability to our country, to protect working people.
The outgoing Conservative leader, Rishi Sunak, brands it the broken promises budget and says it's proof that Labour plan to tax, borrow and spend far beyond what they said during the election campaign.
Broken promise after broken promise, and it is the working people of this country that will pay the price.
We'll hear from the Chancellor, who tonight tells us she can't rule out more tax rises. Plus, we'll be joined live by the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Mel Stride. All that and more with Zarah, Sultana and Rupert Harrison, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Budget Day. I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, today was by any measure a big bang of a budget. It was Labour's first budget for 14 years, and this evening it really does feel like we're in a new political era now. Higher taxes to pay for more investment. And of course, in many ways, that's exactly what you would expect from a Labour budget. We're in a new era, we should get used to it. But you know, the scale of the change today was really quite something. £40 billion in extra taxes is the highest tax burden since records began. And there'll be a red-hot row about whether this counts as a breach of Labour's manifesto. And certainly they want open about tax rises of this scale during that election campaign. We'll be discussing that on the show. But look, many of you might be thinking, if you look at the state of our health service or our schools, more taxes to pay for more investment, yeah, that is fair enough, that is needed. There is something else, though, that it is worth pausing over. The growth forecasts. They are pretty anaemic. In the medium to long term, they've actually been downgraded as a result of this budget. We forget the fastest growing economy in the G7, that doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon, despite all that hard-won, hard-paid-for investment pouring in. And that feels like a pretty thorny problem for a government that says its core mission is growth. Well, let's look through, shall we, some of the detail of what was announced today. The Chancellor is increasing the rate of employers' national insurance by 1.2 percentage points to 15% from April 2025. She also said she'd be reducing the secondary threshold, that's the level at which employers start paying national insurance on each employee's salary, from £9,100 a year to £5,000. On capital gains tax, she's increasing the lower rate from 10% to 18% and the higher rate from 20% to 24%. Rachel Reeves also said there'll be an increase in the stamp duty land tax surcharge on second homes by 2 percentage points to 5%. There were announcements about spending as well. On the NHS, she announced a £22.6 billion increase in the day-to-day health budget, and the core schools budget will be boosted by £2.3 billion next year. The minimum wage is going up by 6.7% to £12.21 an hour, so that's worth up to £1,400 a year for a full-time worker. And finally, it was announced that fuel duty will be frozen next year as well, the thing that seems to always happen in every budget at the minute. So Labour's first budget in 14 years, the first ever by a female Chancellor. By any measure, it was a huge fiscal event. And here is our political editor, Beth Rigby, who reports now on the first budget of the Starmer era with those £40 billion in tax rises.
We've been waiting for this since the general election, the fiscal flesh on the bones of Labour's promise of change. The first Labour budget in nearly 15 years, a defining moment for Britain, delivered by the first female Chancellor.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer.
The scale and scope of Labour's plans are breathtaking. Reeves billing this her new settlement for Britain.
The only way to drive economic growth is to invest, invest, invest. There are no shortcuts. And to deliver that investment, we must restore economic stability, and turn the page on the last 14 years.
But rebuilding comes at a cost. This, the biggest tax-raising budget in decades.
Together, the hole in our public finances this year, which recurs every year, the compensation schemes that they did not fund, and their failure to assess the scale of the challenges facing our public services means that this budget raises taxes by £40 billion.
Paid for by businesses and the wealthy, with hikes to employers' national insurance tax, inheritance tax and capital gains tax. Labour lifting Britain's tax burden to its highest level in history, whilst also promising to protect working people's pay packets.
We are asking businesses to contribute more, and I know that there will be impacts of this measure felt beyond businesses too, as the OBR have set out today. But in the circumstances that I have inherited, it is the right choice to make.
And the scale of new spending seismic too, along with new rules on borrowing to fund it. Defence spending up, although still shy of the 2.5% target. £5 billion more on housing and a massive £25 billion boost for the NHS over the next 2 years.
I commend this statement to the House.
A huge budget and a huge moment, not just for her, but for him too. But the opposition not smiling at all.
The Leader of the Opposition.
What does today's budget do? It raises tax on working people by increasing national insurance and breaking Labour's promise. As the Independent Institute of Fiscal Studies have said, this is a straightforward breach of their manifesto.
4 months on from the election, Rachel Reeves finally showing her hand and defending her choices. £40 billion of taxes. It's the biggest tax-raising budget since 1993. It's gigantic. And you said before the election no plans to raise taxes, or the PM did, beyond the £8 billion that you had earmarked. So a lot of people out there are going to be quite shocked today.
Well, in the decisions that we've made in the budget today, I accept that this is a big and a substantial budget.
But
it wasn't the budget
might feel
that
let
I
down,
was.
that
It wasn't
you
the
weren't
budget.
straight with them.
It wasn't the budget that I was expecting to deliver when I became Chancellor on the 5th of July. I didn't think that any government would be so reckless to have £22 billion of unfunded commitments.
Are you honestly saying that you have a democratic mandate for the measures that you have announced today? Tens of billions of pounds in increased spending and tens of billions of pounds of tax rises, none of which is in this document. You have a democratic mandate for this.
The first line of the first step in our manifesto was to return stability to our economy. That is the most important thing that I had to do as Chancellor. And we do have a mandate for bringing that stability back to the economy.
You're asking the public for £40 billion tax rises. Can you at least reassure people there are no more tax rises after this?
Well, I've committed to just have one budget a year. I'm not coming back to this in the spring.
Parliament.
No, I'm not going to make commitments to never change taxes again. That would be irresponsible. But this is a once-in-a-Parliament budget to wipe the slate clean after the mess that the Conservatives have left us.
Change. It's on the cover of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's manifesto, and today we finally got to understand what that really means. The tax and spending decisions announced in this budget are as historic and hefty as this manifesto was fiscally vague. Most of the things announced are nowhere to be found in this document. And so it raises the question about whether they really have a mandate for all of this tens of billions in new tax and spend. Labour has spent months blaming the Tories for the choices Rachel Reeves now makes. But this is not about the Conservatives anymore. It's about her unprecedented plan to rebuild Britain and whether voters will go along with it or feel misled. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, as you saw there, Beth's been speaking to the Chancellor tonight. She's been asking if the government does have a mandate to deliver this budget.
I think there'll be a lot of people thinking that they voted for you and you have just done the biggest tax and spend budget that we have seen for decades, and that is not what they signed up for.
There were two choices that I had to make today as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The first was whether I was going to be open and honest.
Do you accept that, though? Can you see that the public might feel cheated?
Well,
even if there's a reason, you've explained the reasons, can you see how it looks?
I think the public know the state that the economy was in and the state that our public services were in and the damage that the previous government did to our public finances.
Can you see that people might feel like you've broken their trust?
And the first commitment we made was to bring stability back to the economy. And if I had swept this all under the carpet, I would not have been able to bring that stability back to the economy.
In the manifesto,
and it was stability that the last government forfeited, which sent mortgage rates through the roof.
In the manifesto, you criticised the Conservatives for taking the tax burden to a 70-year high. What is it now at the end of this Parliament after your budget? What will it be?
I'm going to be really straight with people. The tax burden overall goes up. But
What's
we've
it go
made
up to?
decisions.
From where?
It's the highest burden
ever
of tax. I recognise that. But the previous government,
of GDP against 36.4%, which you've been very critical about.
Well, the last government, they increased taxes, but public services got worse. We will improve our public services with the commitments we've made around the National Health Service and schools today, but we have asked the wealthiest in our society and business to pay a bit more, whilst sticking to our manifesto commitment not to increase taxes that working people pay.
I've got that manifesto commitment right here, and it says the Conservatives have raised the tax burden. We will ensure taxes on working people kept as low as possible. Labour will not increase taxes on working people. We will not increase NI, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax, or VAT. Employers, meanwhile, are paying £25 billion of tax on national insurance. It's a broken manifesto pledge. You say here we will not increase national insurance. Well, it's a broken manifesto pledge.
You just read that to me, so and the point there was around working people. Now, there was a lively debate during the election campaign where the Conservatives were really clear that we hadn't ruled out an increase in national insurance.
Well, you haven't, because you've just raised it on employers by £25 billion.
That's exactly what I'm saying, Beth. During the election campaign, there was a lively debate, and the Tories said that we hadn't ruled out an increase in employers' national insurance.
So you always intended to do it, you just didn't want to say?
No. We inherited a £22 billion black hole. Some people said that given that the Tories' cuts to employee national insurance were not funded, that we should have just reversed that. I didn't think that was the right decision, because that would have broken a manifesto
for working
pledge.
people, Paul Johnson says that the increases in employer national insurance actually hits those employing lower paid workers the hardest, and he says probably 3/4 or so of the increase will flow through to lower pay anyway. So you're indirectly hitting workers anyway by raising business taxes by £25 billion.
That's not right, because we've increased the national living wage and the national minimum wage today, and wages can't fall below that level. So the lowest paid people are protected through the national living wage and the national minimum wage. In addition, we have also ensured that the smallest businesses are not going to be paying more national insurance. In fact, 1 million businesses are either paying the same or less national insurance than they were previously.
In 2017, the country rejected a manifesto from Jeremy Corbyn that talked of taxes of £48.6 billion. In 2019, they emphatically rejected planned taxes rises from a Labour manifesto of £82 billion. You now today roll in with a £40 billion tax rise after the general election.
We inherited a situation where there was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. There were commitments to compensate people for infected blood and the Post Office Horizon scandal, and the path for public spending was not honest.
So
we've had to make difficult decisions based on the inheritance that we faced. I don't get to choose the inheritance that I got as Chancellor. I do get to make the choices about how to fill that gap.
You've made choices about massive increases in public spending. You've made choices to settle the public, say, pet sector pay deal. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's full fat on tax and spend. It seems to me like, are you at half fat or are you just being dishonest?
Well, no one's ever compared me to Jeremy Corbyn before. I stood down from his shadow cabinet because I disagreed with everything that he was doing. But if you're faced with a situation where there's a £22 billion black hole in the public finances, you can either sweep that under the carpet, or you can be open and transparent and honest with people about the situation you find yourself in.
40 billion of tax rises and 70 billion in spending.
We have published
in
today,
spending and borrowing.
And we have And we've published today a line-by-line account of the £22 billion.
Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here, which is the public will look at this manifesto, they voted for you, they come out 4 months later, and there is a massive tax rising and massive spending budget from Labour. Do you understand why they might feel cheated by you, that you did not level with them about what the public finances might look after the election? There was a conspiracy of silence. Everyone was talking about the public finances not adding up.
Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility today have published a report. The Office of Budget Responsibility today have published their analysis of how, in the spring budget, the Treasury under the previous government hid spending commitments. I could either sweep that under the carpet like the previous government did, or be open and honest.
Well, let's talk to Beth, shall we? Beth, it seemed quite tense at points in that interview.
Well, I think the thing was, coming out of it, I imagine the Chancellor was very relieved to have delivered that budget. It was absolutely massive, and they've been working on it for months. But the questions I was asking are the obvious questions that the public will be asking too, which is this budget, if you like, now defines the Labour government, and it is very different to what was promised in the manifesto. There's 2 pages in the manifesto of fiscal detail in the whole manifesto, and now we get this scorecard today where all the tax and spend decisions, and it runs to pages and pages and pages and pages, and tens of billions increase in spending, 100 billion in capital investment, 40 billion in tax rises, and it just wasn't discussed before the election, despite our best efforts, both of us, to ask these questions. So what you saw in that interview is me pressing on her repeatedly on these various things, and the Labour Party sticking to the line that it's the economic inheritance from the Conservatives that have forced them into the position. I am not sure that that is going to stand, because even if you do accept the black hole of 22 billion, which is debatable, and 8 billion of it is also Labour's decision to settle on the pay deals, this budget goes far beyond that anyway.
And I guess the success or failure of this budget isn't to be judged now, it's to be judged by how the markets react, what growth is like in the future. Have we got any early signs of that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things here. So, firstly, on the market, government gilt yields are going up, which suggests the markets might be a bit nervous about the scale of the borrowing that was announced today. So that's something to watch. How will the markets react to this massive tax and spend and borrowing budget? In terms of the growth trajectories, what it actually shows from the independent forecasters, the OBI's charts, is that growth kind of goes up in the first 1 or 2 years because they front-loaded all the investment and then it tails off. So this is a budget for growth, and will the growth come through? I think that's a big question. There's also a question about whether or not the £25 billion that they're raising through increasing employers' tax on national insurance contributions actually hampers business investment, i.e. there are lots of unknowns and risks in this budget, so it is a big gamble. But I think I go back to the first principles of that interview, which is the democratic mandate. Labour won a majority on a manifesto that did not spell out the scale of what Starmer intended to do in terms of rebuilding Britain, in terms of borrowing and spending and tax rises. And the government might try and blame it on the Conservatives, but will that land with voters? Because it's not really about the Conservatives anymore, it's about the Labour government and the choices they make. And I think that that is going to be a debate now that rages on in the coming days.
Beth, thank you very much indeed. Beth Rupert there, our political editor. Right, let's bring in, shall we, our first guest tonight, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Mel Stride. Hi. Was it a bit weird? Are you on the other opposite side? It kind of sink in, for today, that you kind of lost the election. We're in a very different new political era now.
It was very worrying, is the way I describe it, because I think exactly as Beth says, the Labour Party, during the run-up to the general election, made clear promises, particularly on tax, said people shouldn't worry about taxes going up left, right and centre. They then confected this black hole that the OBR has said they don't recognise, and then have come forward with the most extraordinary tax, spending and borrowing plan, which is supposed to be all about growth. But actually what the tax has done, particularly national insurance for employers, has meant that we'll see unemployment going up, the OBR says, by 50,000. And of course, growth across the forecast, they're saying, will actually be less than it would have been under their forecast back in March.
Now,
so these are tricky times, I think, for the UK economy as a direct consequence of the decisions that this government has taken.
there's lots to unpick there. You say that they've confected a black hole. Now, I'm sure there is an argument to be had, a very genuine argument about the size of that black hole, whether it is £22 billion. But it is true to say that your spending projections were a fantasy, as described by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And according to the OBR, they said that there was a £9.5 billion shortfall in your spending plans. So I'm not talking about the £22 billion figure, but you left a shortfall, a black hole.
So the IFS were very clear during the run-up to the election that the books were, as they said, wide open. In other words, Labour were very clear about the kind of challenges that lay ahead. On the figure of 22 billion, what the OBR have said is they don't, quote, can't legitimise that number and that black hole.
This is an interview that I did today with Rishi, so I'm aware of what he said on the £22 billion. That's why I'm not talking about £22 billion. He said that there was a multi-billion pound shortfall. The IFS said that there was a fantasy spending projection.
Well, what he said in respect to that,
So,
he said there was an amount, pressure on the departmental expenditure limits, as they're called, that there hadn't therefore been discussions around that with Treasury officials. He laid no blame, by the way, on ministers or the former Chancellor.
Would he?
And therefore, who knows what that may or may not have led to in terms of pressures within the public finances. But this idea of pressures within, in-year pressures within the public finances is nothing new, and they are regularly managed by government across Whitehall. And to the extent that there would have been some impact, that would have been how that would have been dealt with. The critical point still remains, however, that this government has come forward with eye-watering increases in taxation, 40 billion. I don't think we've seen anything like that in a number of generations, probably back to the 1970s and Dennis Healey, all predicated on the idea that this is going to boost growth, which is the way through a lot of the challenges going forward. Well, the figures just simply don't show that. The second thing is that they've fiddled with the fiscal rules, and yet even the margin above those rules, the so-called headroom that we often hear about, the OBR says is small in relation to the significant risks there are around their central forecast. Things like where does inflation go, where does productivity go, where does net migration go, etc. So there are big risks going forward here, and we're seeing some of that early stages in what's happening in the 10-year gilts.
You're right, of course, about the kind of, anemic growth projections, and of course, I think even Labour would accept, that there are sort of risks ahead. It's a difficult economic picture. But I guess the kind of overall thing that some people may be thinking and hurling at the TV right now is that it was you guys who left the public services in a mess, and yes, now Labour's had to raise taxes to fix that.
Look, we went through a very difficult time economically with COVID, which shrank the UK economy overnight by 10%. Then we had inflation imported due to the Ukraine-Russia war. We protected jobs through that period. That cost a lot of money, and we came out through the other side. We went into the last election with a very clear commitment, actually, to get taxes down. And part of the reason we were able to do that was we really addressed this issue, not so much of just spending money left, right and centre, but getting productivity up, which particularly across the public sector has been a problem.
It didn't go down well in the election, did it? Maybe
clearly there were many factors. There were many factors as to why we lost that election. But the other point I was going to make was welfare reform. So we went into that election with a very clear plan as to how we were going to save £12 billion in further welfare reforms. When I was Secretary of State, I'd already saved some billions of pounds around work capability assessments and getting the long-term sick and disability cohort benefits down. Further progress there is something where we would have grasped the nettle, would have spared us a lot of this tax pain that this government is now inflicting on businesses and workers right up and down the country.
It was Rishi Sunak's last moment at the Dispatch box. You, of course, ran to try and replace him as Conservative Party leader. Who are you backing now in the final two?
So I'm not going to go public on that. I've just taken that.
Just tell me. I won't tell anyone. It's fine.
Just between you and me.
Okay. Friends.
All right. Well, I ran myself, as you say. I then did publicly come out to endorse James Cleverly. But now all I'm saying is we have two great candidates. Whoever prevails and is announced as the winner on Saturday, I will row behind, and we will continue to hold this government to account.
So are you not backing anyone publicly because you hope both of them will make you Shadow Chancellor?
No, I've no idea what either of them has as an intention in that respect. No, I'm just going to wait to see what happens, and as I say, whoever wins this, I will support them completely.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Mel Stride, there. Well, the budget, of course, sure to dominate tomorrow's newspapers. We're going to have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us for that will be the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the Daily Mail's Whitehall editor, that is Claire Elcott. That's coming up next. Right, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The independent MP, Zarah Sultana, and the former Chief of Staff to George Osbourne, Rupert Harrison. Great to have you both with us.
Thank you.
You know a thing or two about budgets. What do you make of this one?
Well, the main thing is I totally agree with Beth's point that this is just totally different to the entire election campaign. All the questions you had that you posed to Labour spokespeople in this studio just suddenly spring. It's not just 40 billion, it's 40 billion pounds of tax rises and 30 billion pounds of borrowing, when the entire election campaign was no tax rises over and above what was in the manifesto and no additional borrowing. So it's a huge change. The other thing I think is it's quite a sort of old Labour budget. It's not even really a Gordon Brown or a new Labour budget. It's a big tax rise and then a lot of money being pushed straight into the NHS with no discussion of reform. We just heard about productivity. I mean, actually, the last government really struggled with productivity in the NHS. It's down hugely since the pandemic. There seems to be no thinking or narrative about money going with reform, which we've heard a lot from Keir Starmer in the last few weeks, but there's no substance to that. So it feels like very old-fashioned tax and spend, and then a lot of borrowing, which, as you rightly mentioned, is, I think, sparking a little bit of concern in the market. So it's quite a big gamble.
Zarah, what do you make of it?
I think there are some positive things in the budget. The increase in funding for the NHS, the compensation packages for the infected blood scandal and the Post Office Horizon scandal, but no mention of the WASPy women when you've got a parliamentary ombudsman saying that they deserve compensation. If we look at other measures like a capital gains tax, I would want equalisation in that policy rather than just the increase that's been announced. Also on the national minimum wage, which will make a material difference to people's lives. Again, I would like to see the Labour government go further and announce £15 an hour, which is what trade unions and many others are calling for. So what concerns me is the fact that the budget also includes the Tories' welfare reforms, which is just coded language for cuts to disability benefits. And we know what austerity did to this country. It's estimated that it led to the excess death of over 330,000 people. And that's what I worry about. That's what my constituents worry about. So going forward, we need to see the reversal of the winter fuel allowance measure and the means testing, scrapping of the two-child benefit cap, and also other measures like increasing the bus cap to £3, which is a 50% increase. All of these policies are regressive and harm the most poor in our country.
You were obviously in the Treasury throughout the kind of austerity period, if you like, under sort of George Osbourne. How sort of difficult do you think the choices are that Rachel Reeves is grappling with? She's saying, look, we had a terrible economic inheritance and we're having to make some difficult choices.
Well, her terrible economic inheritance she's been talking about was blown out of the water today by the OBR. So your interview with Richard Hughes, he said that he can't legitimise the 22 billion.
He did say there was a shortfall.
He actually said there was a shortfall of 9 billion of overspend. That's quite a normal number. I've been in the Treasury many years. Mid-year, to have a 9 billion overspend is pretty normal. As Mel said earlier, it gets managed down through underspends elsewhere. What the OBR actually said is that the biggest number they might have changed in the forecast, had they known, is they might have reduced their forecast underspend from 3 billion to 0. So the biggest number you could get out of that OBR report is 3 billion, and yet we've got 40 billion of tax rises, 30 billion of extra borrowing. So it's totally confected. You go back to 2010, the huge difference was mandate. Again, coming back to what Beth was saying, the Conservatives had spent the whole year running up to the 2010 election saying the public finances are in a historic mess, we're going to have to do very difficult things on public spending. That probably cost the Conservatives the majority, as why we ended up in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And as a result, there was a mandate for the government to take difficult decisions. I just don't think there is a mandate for what we heard today.
It's probably fair to say you're not on the same kind of natural wing of the Labour Party as Keir Starmer. I think it's probably fair to say. Were you sort of pleasantly surprised in any way by the amount of tax and investment that we've seen?
I think it's the right direction to go in. When we look at the state of our public services, when we look at living standards, when we look at the proliferation of food banks in our country, Coventry has one of the biggest food banks in the country, and people who are working are having to make difficult decisions around heating and eating. So we have to invest, and we need huge infrastructure projects as well. But what I struggle with, I guess, with this budget is it simply doesn't go far enough. It's important that we invest in our public services, and any criticism of pay deals with doctors and train drivers, I mean, these are workers that have seen their wages fall in real terms over the past decade, and actually we need to invest in them.
OK, thanks both very much indeed. We'll have lots more from both of you on the budget throughout the programme. Thank you. Well, Labour promised that this would be a budget for working people, with people not seeing tax rises on their pay slips. The minimum wage is going up, fuel duty has been frozen again, and draft beer duty is being cut, which help pubs. And national correspondent Tom Parmenter has been taking a look at whether this budget really is for working people.
This was the budget that claimed to back the workers. So in the People's Park in Grimsby, the verdict. For Brad, on a minimum wage, it's a 6.7% pay rise.
It's great for me because obviously someone on minimum wage means I'm earning more, can afford to do more. Obviously being my age, I'm 23, maybe actually looking to rent in my own house and things like that. It's going to increase people's motivation to work. Even people who aren't working, maybe they're going to want to work more.
Karen teaches, so is somewhere in the middle, but still feels the strain.
I'm struggling. I'm really struggling. You know, as a family, we've talked about Christmas this year, what we're not going to do, rather as opposed to what we are going to do, because we're all struggling, you know. So the middle people, I think, get ignored a lot of the time.
Vanessa, like many grandparents, has given up work to help her daughter save on childcare costs. She doesn't buy the Chancellor's pitch of protecting the working people.
I am disappointed that they do seem to be targeting the working man. It's like putting up the minimum cost of the bus fares from £2 to £3. People that go to work have got to still get to work, and it's taking money out of their pocket to get there.
The government would say that rise unlocks investment to transport in places like Grimsby. But what really matters is the money people have now.
I'd say it's a mixed picture. The very lowest paid in society are better off. No doubt about it at all. £1,400 for someone on a minimum wage a year. That's a big deal. Those on lower incomes, mixed picture. Middle incomes, mixed picture. Probably more take than give. Those on higher incomes, I'm afraid you're going to have to dig deep into your pocket for this one.
There are middle-income strivers all over the country, like the Matthewmans in Essex. Busy parents with good jobs. Ahead of the budget, they mapped out where every penny of their income goes, and it's tight. They can't see anything from the Chancellor that alleviates their pain.
Nothing's changed. We are exactly the same as we were yesterday.
So, yeah, we'll just carry on as we are with our spreadsheet and tinkering away at it and, you know, getting the most out of our money that we can.
So like households across the nation, it's back to the spreadsheet to work out where this budget leaves them and how they'll pay next month's bills. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
If you want to see if you're better or worse off after Rachel Reeves' budget earlier, we've got a calculator that you can check. Just scan the QR code on your screen right now. Right, let's chat to Zarah and Rupert a little bit more, shall we? Zarah, I guess budgets, you know, we have all our analysis that we do on these programmes immediately afterwards, but it's really, what really matters is how people feel in the days, weeks, months ahead, when they get the pay slip, when they see if it impacts their job or their supermarket shop. What do you think the kind of real-term impact of it might be?
In terms of my inbox, the most casework I've got from a constituent since getting re-elected is their concerns around the winter fuel allowance. And that, when you think about the impact that has on people, there are millions of people, millions of elderly people who are worried about how they are going to heat their homes this winter. When we think of the impact of cuts to disability benefits, people are going to worry about that. What does that mean for them if they're being told that their work capability assessments need to be done? And when we look at the two-child benefit cap, recent research by the IFS said that 540,000 children could be lifted out of absolute poverty if that was scrapped. This is how you can make a material difference to people's lives immediately, not in a year or two. And that's what we need to be doing. The Labour Party was elected on a mandate for change. That's what people need, and not a return to any form of austerity.
What do you make of it all? I mean, Labour's made a big play, haven't they, of kind of, protecting working people so they don't feel it, like kind of, I guess, invisible tax changes. But how do you think it's going to filter through?
The thing is, they're only invisible on budget day or when you get your first payslip. They're very visible a few years down the line when they have an impact on wages. And so you mentioned those very weak growth forecasts that are surprisingly weak, that underpin the forecast. Within that, even worse is that real household disposable income is forecast to only grow by 2% over the whole of the 5-year period. That's weaker than we've had over the last 5 years. And one reason for that is that when you get this big employer national insurance rise, that puts pressure on wages. So the OBR are allowing for the fact that wages are going to grow more slowly because of the tax rise. So it's only invisible to begin with. It's very real after that. But one of the things I think is strangest about the way Rachel Reeves has designed the big tax rise is that it's a Labour tax rise, but actually the biggest impact is on people on low pay. Because the biggest part of the revenue rise is, it's a little bit complicated, but reducing the threshold at which you start paying employer national insurance from £9,100 down to £5,000. That means that between £5,000 and £9,000, that tax rate is going from 0 up to 15%. So that's a huge impact on people with part-time jobs, low pay, and I think that is a worrying angle, that actually you've got this overall OBR forecast for weak income growth. It might actually be weakest for the people on lowest income.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, I guess there is the, what do you make of that? Do you worry about the impact on low income, or I guess there is a rise in the minimum wage as well?
Absolutely. We need to be increasing people's wages. We have a low-wage economy, which has an economy that also has a lot of precarious work, people who work in industries like Deliveroo, well, for companies like Deliveroo and Uber, where their wages and their rights need to be improved, and that's what the New Deal for Working People sets to improve. But people need to be able to feel the impact now. And when I think of the announcement around bus fares, people are going to feel that instantly in January, and that's what they remember. A lot of people think, politics is something that happens in Westminster, but it's the cost of milk, it's your bus fare, it's the fact that, you might struggle to get GP appointments. And unless they feel that change quite soon, I think the arguments around this is what we've inherited and pin it on the Tories, which was the Tory strategy in 2010, I just don't think it lands anymore.
OK, thanks both very much. Indeed, really interesting chat to have. We've been talking, of course, about much of today's £40 billion worth of tax rises falling at the door of businesses, and some warnings that the bigger contributions to national insurance that many are going to have to make will mean that they recruit less and perhaps give out fewer pay rises as well. Here's Sky's business correspondent Paul Kelso now on how they're bearing the brunt.
A bird's eye view of the budget as seen by the businesses of Bristol. The capital of the west of England is the strongest economic performer of the UK's large cities beyond London. But this budget may weigh down even established high flyers like Cameron Balloons.
I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Founder Don has seen 17 chancellors since opening the doors in 1971. By increasing national insurance at a stroke, Rachel Reeves has made the battle with European competitors harder to win.
We're dealing with people who pay about half what we do, and with a much lower tax rate, lower cost of living. So it's difficult to compete with. But when we do the payroll at the end of the month, about 40% is going to the government.
The national insurance hike will raise £25 billion, but with business rates and the minimum wage going up, a penny off a pint in alcohol duty won't touch the sides here.
Since 2020, really, everything's been squeezed so tight. We're making like half the profit that we were making back then, and now we're looking at more costs added to that, business rates more than doubling. There's going to be no room for any mistakes, basically, no room for growth, no room to be able to look to the future. I think that's what's one of the most difficult things for us.
Rachel Reeves is asking businesses to do the heavy lifting of repairing the public finances, but they won't do it alone. Even the Office for Budget Responsibility, that's the Treasury's watchdog, says that employees, the working people Labour say they want to protect, will pay a price, perhaps in lower pay rises or fewer jobs. The aim is that improved public services will help deliver growth, but public spending will remain tight. That could mean less for local authority-funded venues like the Watershed on Bristol Harbour.
We're supporting over 500 creatives, and what we hear from them is that their income has gone down over £12,000 each in the last year. Normally, we would be concentrating on that, really thinking about how we could help them, but actually this year we've got to concentrate on getting our oxygen mask on ourselves.
After tax and spend, borrowing to fund the biggest public investment programme since the 1960s is the third leg of this budget. But with business investment also forecast to decline thanks to the tax squeeze, the Chancellor's big bet on economic liftoff carries the risk of a mighty fall. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Bristol.
Well, all governments, in many ways, hinge their economic plans on growth, and of course it's always been right at the centre of Keir Starmer's vision to create the country he wants. With all that investment, you would be forgiven for thinking surely it may even mean some positive growth forecasts to come. But it hasn't quite worked out like that. Here's our economics and data editor, Ed Conway.
This was a big budget, far bigger than expected, and a massive change in terms of taxation and in terms of spending. This is showing you, going back to the 1970s, just how much each different fiscal event, so budgets and autumn statements, have raised taxes or indeed cut them. Look where the bars are. And look at this time around, OK? So this particular budget raised taxes an awful lot. In fact, by the biggest amount that we have seen going all the way back to 1993. That was Norman Lamont post-Black Wednesday. Well, this, in terms of raising taxes, is actually not that far away from that. And of course, we're talking about higher national insurance, we're talking about higher inheritance tax, we're talking about higher capital gains tax. But add it all up, and you're talking about the burden of overall taxation here rising considerably. It was expected to rise. So this is Jeremy Hunt's plans back in March. The tax burden was going to go up. But when the Labour Party gave their manifesto, they said, yeah, we're going to raise taxes a wee bit higher than that. But what we just heard about today was not just a wee bit higher, it was massively higher. That is a significant jump in terms of UK taxation, taking the total tax burden, this is your incidence, just how much we're all paying in terms of all taxes, to the highest rate that we've ever seen on record. Now, it's worth just saying the UK, when it comes to comparing us with other countries, we are more or less mid-table when it comes to just how heavily taxed we are. That's the UK, that red bar there. And you can see other countries like Iceland, Japan and the rest are kind of around the same level. What does this do? It takes us up a little bit. So we go up from being kind of mid-table to slightly higher mid-table as a result of this, but still below some Scandinavian countries or Germany, but way above, for instance, Ireland and the United States. But all of that being said, the reason for this higher taxation is in part for the government to spend more, in particular spend money on investment. So the previous government, their plan was to cut investment in the coming years. Look at where Rachel Reeves is planning to push investment. Higher investment in the near term, and then still considerably higher investment in the Conservative plans looking out into the future. But here's the concern. There's actually two concerns for the Chancellor. First of all, it's not really turning into quite as much growth as she might have liked. This is the growth forecast from the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, last time around. So growth going up, and economic growth is really kind of what matters, and you invest more in order to generate more growth so we have money in our pockets. And bear in mind, this government says it wants to have the highest growth rate in the G7. That was last time around. Look at this time, OK? So the bars come up. They're a little bit higher in the first 2 years, but look at 2026, 27 and so on. Downgraded, 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 and weaker growth off into the future than expected. That goal of trying to get the highest growth in the G7, that looks very unlikely indeed. The other thing I think that will concern the Chancellor is this, the market reaction. Now, we look at government bond rates. It's how much people charge the UK to lend money to them, essentially. Remember, after the Truss budget, they went up through the roof. This time around, OK, so there's a 10-year government bond rate. They stayed relatively low during the speech. But once those documents were published and people started to look at the numbers, in particular all that borrowing, just look at that line. It went up. Not enough, perhaps, to show anything like panic, but definitely a considerable level of disquiet about all that extra borrowing that's coming from the Chancellor.
Ed Conway there, crunching through the numbers in that budget. Well, given the scale of the tax rises that we've seen today, one of the big questions is whether people voting for Labour at the general election expected this. Earlier, I also spoke to the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. £40 billion of tax rises, the tax burden the largest since records began. Were you elected on a false promise?
We were elected on a promise to restore stability to the economy and to fix the foundations of our country, and that's exactly what this budget sets out to do. This is a once-in-a-generation budget. There are big changes in this budget to make sure that we restore stability, we fix the foundations, fix the NHS, and invest in the future of our country, and that's exactly what this budget sets out to do.
You say that you weren't elected on a false premise, but at the same time, multiple times throughout the election campaign, you were promising no additional tax rises. On the 28th of May, Rachel Reeves, there are no additional tax rises needed beyond the ones that I've said. Keir Starmer to Beth Rigby in Grimsby, there's going to be no need to raise tax on the plans we're setting out, no tax surprises. Well, today was a big tax surprise, wasn't it?
Well, look, firstly, our key promise was about protecting working people, and as a result of the measures announced by the Chancellor, taxes on working people's pay slips will not go up. There's no increase in the national insurance or the income tax that working people pay on their pay slips.
It's a different
that is a promise made and a promise
That's a different
kept.
promise. At no point during the election campaign were you saying there would be no increases to taxes on pay slips. That's a new form of words that you've introduced since the election.
Well, it's taxes on working people, and we said we would protect our working people. That's a promise made and it's a promise kept, because it's exactly what we've done through this budget. We also set out measures we would change, VAT on private schools, ending the non-dom tax status and so on. All of that was predicted to raise £8.5 billion in our manifesto. It's now £9 billion we've delivered. So that's another promise made and a promise kept. But, I need to be straightforward with you, Sophie, that since coming into office, as you well know, we've discovered the £22 billion black hole, which is based on information which the previous government did not share with the OBR when they made their March forecast. We've learned that some of the commitments the previous government made were correct commitments around compensation for Post Office Horizon victims and victims of the infected blood scandal. Those promises were made, but they weren't funded.
I just don't accept this. I understand that there was a pretty terrible economic inheritance. I don't think people would argue with it, but we knew about that before the election. We knew that the projected public spending plans were effectively a fantasy. People were saying that left, right and centre, but you deliberately played along with that fantasy for your own political purposes.
Well, no, look, I think we knew that we were going to have a difficult time if we won the general election. But I think what's very clear going into office is that when we asked the Treasury to look at the books, the £22 billion of unfunded spending pressure in year was a shock to us, and indeed the OBR had said that they weren't told about it when they were preparing their March forecast. And the OBR have been very clear that had they known that information when they were developing their March forecast under the previous government, it would have been materially different. So what the OBR said in March would have been materially different if the previous government had not covered up the information from them.
We knew about the economic inheritance during the election campaign. It was widely known from everyone from the Institute for Fiscal Studies to politicians to journalists asking them questions of all parties that the projected spending was a fantasy, and you played along with it to get that Ming vase over the line, and it's only now that you're being upfront about it.
We were upfront throughout the election campaign that we were going to inherit a difficult situation. As I said, there are things we discovered in office.
Why didn't you talk about tax rises during the election campaign then?
We talked about the specific tax rises which we would do to make spending commitments that we were committed to in the election. I've mentioned some of them already: VAT on private schools, non-dom loophole, going after tax avoidance.
How much is VAT on private schools?
Well, collectively, those promises are £8.5 billion, and we're raising £9 billion through the measures announced in the budget today from those
£40 billion
particular
taxes now. That's 4 times as much.
Look, Sophie, there's no getting away from the fact that this is a budget that makes changes which are once-in-a-generation changes. This is a budget which tries to reset the economy, reset the country after the mess of the last 14 years.
Right, let's bring in Rupert and Zarah, shall we? There's so much to chew over, isn't there, with the budget? And it does feel like, we're talking about the impact that people will feel in the weeks, months, years even ahead. But also there's going to be the market reaction and the business reaction too. We've been getting a little bit of a sense of that, haven't we, with the kind of gilt market reaction?
Yeah, look, there was, as Ed was saying in that piece, there was definitely a reaction, and there has been a reaction over the last couple of months. So it's not like the Liz Truss episode yet. I don't think it will become like that, but it is just, there's a premium, as market participants call it. There's an extra price that we are paying on our debt because of this increase in borrowing. And I think that just increases risks in the years ahead. So, for example, if Rachel Reeves needs to come back for more, if she needs to borrow more, if the forecasts take a turn for the worse, we're just more vulnerable as a result of this than we would otherwise have been.
I mean, I guess there'll be some who argue that, look, businesses are going to have to suck up a bit of the pain, right? Because if we are going to improve our public services and get the kind of spending on the NHS or our schools that we want to, then the money's going to have to come from somewhere.
And it should come from the very wealthiest. The broadest shoulders should shoulder the burden. And when we look at the lowest corporation tax in the G7, I don't think that's something to brag about. We should be looking at those avenues in terms of tax revenue, as well as income tax for the very wealthiest. And the party and the government, by making commitments not to increase those taxes, have put themselves into this situation, which is unfortunate given how popular wealth taxes are amongst the public, and also policies like renationalisation of energy companies as well as rail, but water as well. These are popular. The argument's already been won, but it's about political will.
What do you think about wealth taxes? Is it, the kind of the thing that we must never talk about, the kind of taboo that all politicians sort of shy away from? What's your...
The problem is they sound great, but actually trying to implement them, you have contact with reality. And the problem is that people have choices. They can move, they can decide not to start a business. And it's interesting, we had a lot of criticism by Conservatives of the OBR over the last few years. But actually, the OBR has been torpedoing some wishful thinking from the left just as much as it torpedoed wishful thinking from the right over the last few years. I think the government came in with a lot of big numbers that they thought they could raise from things like capital gains tax, inheritance tax, non-doms. And the reality is those numbers have been knocked down to size because the problem is you whack up those taxes and then you get a behavioural response. And the truth is, in a global economy, it always sounds like a kind of easy political solution, saying if only we could tax the 1%, all our problems would be solved. The problem is it's very difficult to do in practice. The 1% don't need to live in Britain. They don't need to start businesses in Britain. They can go somewhere else.
What would you say to that?
But they don't, because their kids go to schools here, they have family here, they speak English, they like the UK. And this scaremongering has happened for over a decade, that the wealthy will just leave, and they haven't.
This isn't scaremongering, it's the OBR. It's the Independent Office of Responsibility looking at the data and the evidence and saying, unfortunately, Labour government, if you put up this tax on non-doms, for example, you're going to end up losing revenue, not making revenue. So it's not fancy, it's real hard numbers.
So we shouldn't pursue these policies which make economic sense, and instead we should put
Well, we shouldn't pursue tax rises that lose money, definitely.
I just don't agree. I think unless we tax big tech, you think about Google, you think about Amazon, and it's not ordinary people, it's not small businesses, you are missing out on a huge chunk of tax revenue, and you're not going to address the huge challenges that we have in our public services. I don't find it acceptable to let Google and Amazon pay less tax than nurses, doctors and teachers in my constituency, and that's the arrangement within our tax regime that we currently have.
Get the sense you two aren't going to agree anytime soon.
Well, I actually totally agree on that. On the big companies, I mean, the problem is, at the moment, is the United States. So there was a huge international agreement that we started when we were in government, the OECD agreement on base erosion and profit shifting, taxation of tech. The problem is you need the whole world to do it, otherwise it doesn't work. And
it takes leadership, and we need that.
It's a great chat, though. Great debate. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Today also marked a last hurrah for one man. We're going to mark another milestone today, the end of the political career, shall we say, of Rishi Sunak. Stay with us.
Are you ready to make your voices heard?
As America votes, win, 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 win.
Get ready for an election night like no other.
Join our team stateside
as we get close to the action
and bring you the results as they arrive.
With full reaction and comprehensive analysis guiding you through the night.
In an election which could have huge consequences around the world.
America Votes, Election Night Live. Get the full story first on Sky News.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
Enormous explosion that's just come down. I think it was a monster just landed in between us.
Hundreds and hundreds of people hoping to get north, ultimately to get to the United States. It's a border where they're not welcome, and yet they keep coming.
We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people, taking them out and putting them into trucks and taking them away.
They make about 50 kilos of fentanyl a week. It's incredibly dangerous and toxic stuff.
There's been an upsurge in deaths
the fighting between the gangs is getting more and more vicious.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades, which is over there. This is much more like a normal town. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change.
We're being crushed. Free from wherever you get your news.
We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. This is real, hardcore emergency medicine.
The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world. Sky News, the full story first.
Hundreds of thousands of people have been using the beast for years to traverse Mexico, but it is really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
Now, we've been talking today about how it all felt a bit like a new political era, which of course means it's also the end of the previous Rishi Sunak one, the previous Conservative one as well. But before the leader of the opposition responded to the budget as Conservative leader, today, of course, was also his final Prime Minister's questions. And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, joked during her budget that he might be flying off to California soon, but of course, Rishi Sunak's insisting he's going to stay on as an MP and the backbenchers. And as he bid a kind of sort of farewell today, he said if anyone needs him, he'll be in what he called the greatest place on earth, Yorkshire. Let's bring in our duo for tonight. Rishi Sunak, how do you think he's going to be remembered then?
Well, I hope he's remembered for today, actually. It was great to see him with a bit of kind of fire and passion. He got great reviews for his response. I'm personally a big fan of his. I think he inherited an incredibly difficult situation where the Conservative Party had imploded under Liz Truss. And then he had a very difficult couple of years in government. I think we'll look back on him as being a good Prime Minister in difficult circumstances. But, today we saw real passion and fire in the belly, and maybe that was a good way to go out.
How do you think he'll be remembered?
I think he'll be remembered in history as breaking a glass ceiling, the first ethnic minority Prime Minister, but I do think there's limits to that kind of representation politics. And for me, what he did in government as Chancellor, as Prime Minister, wasn't to help ordinary people. And in fact, living standards, kind of the state of our public services, is what he should be remembered by. And in fact, I'm worried about what's yet to come with whoever replaces him, because they both frighten me.
OK, thanks both very much indeed. I did like the moment when he was sort of saying that he's kind of like going to be lobbying Keir Starmer about all the kind of constituency issues, so if you can get a bit of time with him as well. I think it was a coast-to-coast walk that goes through his Yorkshire constituency or something as well. Thanks both very much indeed. Well, that is it from us tonight. It has been a big day. I feel like I need to go and get a drink after the programme. I don't know about you. I'm going to see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Me. It's going to be live from Cleethorpes. See you tomorrow.